In James 4:12 it says, "Who are you to judge another?" And of course Jesus tells us in Matthew 7 that when we see that speck in each other's eyes, and I'll tell you, even a little speck in our eyes can hurt. But remember, if you're ignoring something bigger in that eye, your own eye, if you're ignoring the proverbial log, then be very, very careful. When we were here last week, we saw that James raised this matter of submitting to God, giving God the first place in our life. And with that comes victory over Satan's devices. It will result in further mourning for sin, God revealing different areas of our life that need to change, areas that need to be dealt with, sins to be abandoned, repented of, confessed. He tells us to humble ourselves in the sight of God in verse 10. And again, it's like, what more can James say? Surely he's dealt with having the right kind of heart for God, the right kind of life for God. But then he turns his attention back toward how we speak about each other and to each other. A believer who is submitted to God, that's going to impact how we speak about each other. And James in verse 11 three times talks to his brothers and sisters in the church. 3 times he talks to a brother. This is a family discussion. James does love those whom he writes to. And though he has some fairly direct, harsh words, this is a family in-house discussion. He says, "Do not speak evil of one another, brethren." Now, that doesn't quite do justice to what he's saying. It means stop speaking evil of each other, brethren. What you have a tendency to do, what some of you are doing now, you need to put an end to it. I realise that simply telling someone to stop doesn't always work. May work most of the time, but not all the time. He says, stop speaking evil of each other. This was mutual. It wasn't that there was just one person in the church that had the gift of gossip, right? This was a sort of a mutual thing that was happening from time to time in the church. And merely by James saying, brother, brother, brother. No, this is not how it's supposed to be in God's family. Your brothers and sisters. He's emphasizing their equality. That before Christ, we're his children, no matter how old we are or what role we have, we're his children. And being in the family demands that we speak a certain way about each other. Someone has said that if we are really low before God, we don't have any altitude left to talk down toward others. If we're on the floor before God, then there's nothing left to look down upon others. Now, in the Old Testament, for instance, there were commands to do with slandering people. Slandering. In Leviticus 19:16, there's a command not to go around slandering gossip among your people. Slandering has to do with not only lying about people, it might be overreacting to things that they've done or said, exaggerating. But it's really repeating needlessly things that people do that were wrong or ungodly or things like that. And so when James talks in verse 11 about don't be speaking evil of each other, I realise that all of us, we do wrong things. And we say wrong things. But that doesn't mean that we then have the right to go and broadcast that to everyone else all the time. That's not helpful. And that doesn't help anyone change and grow in their spiritual walk. And right through the New Testament, you have this category of evil speaking, running people down and highlighting their faults and repeating things that they did many years, often things that they may have repented of and confessed and dealt with before God. It's funny that things that God has chosen to not remember, we keep raising. Things that God has forgiven, that's under the blood, that's dealt with eternally, we can have the habit of just sort of giving it life and oxygen. Now, we also know from the Bible that there are times when we need to talk about the bad behaviour of others. Okay, now, let me try and give you an example of this. Jesus, throughout the Gospels, when he confronted the Pharisees and the religious leaders that were drawing others aside, he, for instance, in Matthew 12:34, he called them a brood of vipers. You're a bunch of snakes. In fact, he said, how can you, being evil, speak good things? So the Lord said, you are evil. You are evil. You're like snakes. Well, remember, Jesus is God's Son. And he has a certain authority that we do not possess the way he does. But by and large, we only would talk about, the faults of others when someone needs to be, protected. Someone is in danger. Someone's in danger. I've had pastors in churches where they've had people come and someone's looking for a husband or wife. Usually it's someone looking for a wife. And, a guy trying to take advantage of some ladies. And the pastor steps in and says, okay, I've got to warn some people about this fellow, right? Where someone needs to be protected. When you have a false teacher, someone that's teaching things falsely, publicly, it's not wrong to say, okay, what this person's teaching is contrary to God's word, and it makes them a false teacher. There are times when during church discipline, when it's necessary, and again, it's not even with everyone, church visitors and whatever else. It's going to be in a regulated meeting, and you know what? In the years I've been pastor here, it's only after you've had a fairly exhaustive process of restoration, of attempted restoration, that you would have to say to members, look, this member is caught in this sin. Pray for them. Here's what we need to do as a church. That is not evil speaking. It's necessary. But what James is condemning here is sinful, destructive speech that brings comprehensive judgments against another brother or a sister. You have believers pretending like they are the judge and jury and making comprehensive statements about other brothers and sisters as though they are better than them. As believers, we have received God's grace, and as believers, you know what we yearn for? We yearn to be changed. We yearn to grow in Christ likeness. We yearn to be more along the pathway as the months and years roll on. We ought to be aware of things we have done and said, and said, Lord, help me not to repeat those, so that a year or two from now, I'm going to be a better Christian for you. Well, that's what we ought to hope for others. For others. And so we don't look at each other and say, well, once a liar, always a liar. Once this, always this. Once lazy, always lazy. We shouldn't look at each other in those terms. That's not how we want God to look at us. That's not how we would see ourselves. So don't project that on other people in the church. If you look at James chapter 4, if you look at verse 11, to speak evil has the idea of slandering. And we know that the devil is a slanderer. A slanderer. Now, you would think that we know Satan is a very powerful fallen being. Very powerful fallen. Was that Satan? And we know that he has millions of beings under him. So you would think that when he brings accusations against God's people, right, he'd have to be right, would you not? You would think that I know he doesn't know as much as God knows. He can only be in one place at a time. He's not an eternal being, but he knows a lot more than we do. You would think that when he brings slanders to God, that he would have to be right, that he would have to be, rock solid, watertight. But you know what? When Satan slandered Job, he was wrong. He was wrong. Remember in Job 1, Satan says to God, look, does Job fear you for nothing? When nothing goes right, is he going to fear you? You've set a hedge around him. You've blessed his household. Stretch out your hand and he's going to curse you to your face. He's wrong. Satan's slanders are wrong, oftentimes. And in chapter 2, even after Job has these losses, Satan says, well, look, skin for skin, all that a man has will give for his life. Stretch out your hand now, touch his bone and flesh, and he'll surely curse you. Job doesn't. So Satan was wrong. So we're going to be really, really careful how we think and talk about other people. Are we basing what we have said on something second or third hand? Second or third hand. We rarely know all the circumstances. We rarely know all the circumstances. And even if we see something happen at church or in someone's home or other things, we don't always know the context or what happened later. But God knew. He saw. He was aware. He knew it. He's the lawgiver. So follow James' reasoning in chapter 4, verse 11. Okay. He says in verse 11, don't speak evil of one another, brethren. How often when we do that, we think we're in the right, they're in the wrong, we're better, they're worse. James says, actually, when you're running someone down, here is what is happening. This is actually what is happening. He says in verse 11, he who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother. Okay, we've decided to comprehensively deal with their character, things like that. What are we doing? We're speaking evil of God's law. That's what we're doing. We think we're just speaking evil of a brother. Actually, we are not just running down a brother or sister, we're running down God's law. God has given us words about this. He's told us to avoid this, and we're saying, I know better than God. God's told me not to slander, but I have to be some kind of exception somewhere for me. No. Do we want to be speaking evil of God's law? I don't think so. I don't think so. Not only are we speaking evil of the law, we are judging the law. I mean, look at the parallel. The second part of verse 11 speaks evil of a brother, judges his brother. James says, no, you're actually speaking evil of God's law, and you are judging the law. Friends, the role of God's law is to judge us. And there's a reversal going on. It's a reversal. And when we engage in things like slander unnecessarily, talking about other people's faults and sins, we are very foolishly assuming the role of God. That's a very dangerous place to be in. They are big shoes to fill, friends. They're big shoes to fill. And we can't fill them. We cannot. And then he says, worst of all, he says, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. Gossips and slanderers manage to fill their days and their hours with everything but what they should be doing. Whenever we hear of things that people struggling with sin or other kinds of things, our first reaction should be, God, I want to pray for this brother or sister. Pray for them, help them, and God, please help me because my flesh is just as bad. I'm just as fallen. I'm just as made of the dust as they are. We are no better. Don't we want to be a doer of the law rather than a judge of God's law? Look at verse 12 today. Look at verse 12. James says, and he's pointing out the obvious, but we forget this. There is one lawgiver, not two. We're not the second. There's but one lawgiver, and notice this, who is able to save and to destroy. That is true today, friends. God can save and he can destroy. He can save a person. They put their faith in Jesus Christ. He can destroy eternally when someone rejects him, the offer of salvation. Since there's one lawgiver and there's one person who has power over human destiny and human behavior, God will bring every work to judgment, Ecclesiastes says. Every word, every action. God is going to take care of all of those things perfectly. He says, who are you to judge one another? We've all had those times when someone said, who are you? Who are you? You know, we make a complaint. Who are you? Oh, you want to cook tonight? You want to cook tonight? Go right ahead. No, thanks. Who are you? That's what James says. Who are you to judge one another? There's only one person who gets to make final definitive statements about you and I. And it's not the pastor. It's not even the deacons. I'll say it twice. It's not even, no. It's not church members. It's God. It is God that gets to make final statements about us. I'm thankful for the way in the New Testament God changes people. Changes people. People that had done some outrageous things. Incredible things. But the Lord persisted with them. Jesus persisted with his disciples. Peter said some outrageous things the night before Christ died. Outrageous things. God used him later. Paul had companions that turned on him. Some came back. And he had to recount some of the things they had done. Had to. But God changed them. We don't want to take God's authority out of his hands or try to. And I guess my challenge today is even when, and there are times when, as parents and in our marriages and other things, and we have to share hard things with each other, hard things, there's a way to do that. There's a way to do that that is helpful, that's not destructive, that doesn't try and go for the jugular, doesn't try and destroy the person in front of us. If you would turn over just a few pages to Colossians 4, Colossians chapter 4, verse number 6. Very, very helpful words. It says this way. He says in Colossians 4:6, let your speech always be with grace. It's with grace. Even when some hard things are shared, even when they are shared, let it be with grace. Grace. Because that's how God deals with us in grace. If God took grace out of the equation, we perish. You understand that? If God took grace out of the equation with us today, we perish. There's no hope. No hope. There's grace. Be with grace. And he uses an illustration that we all get, seasoned with salt. Seasoned with salt. Throw in some goodness. Grace, seasoned with salt. That you may know how you ought to answer each one. That communication back and forth. It's not what to say, it's how to say it. It's how to say it. It's communication that holds out hope. It holds out hope for people. It's words that offer forgiveness and a willingness to move forward and to sort things out. Sometimes we are hurt by other people's actions, and sometimes we're not just meant to overlook it and, forgive, not raise it. Sometimes for their sake, for your sake, you've got to raise it. It's not about just sweeping everything under the carpet. But when you deal with things above the carpet, when you deal with things that are above the carpet, do so gracefully. Gracefully. It makes a difference. A soft answer turns away wrath. And so even when we have those difficult conversations, and we've got to talk about the evil in our hearts, do so in a way that honours God. In James 4:12 it says, who are you to judge another? And of course Jesus tells us in Matthew 7 that when we see that speck in each other's eyes, and I'll tell you, even a little speck in our eyes can hurt. Even a little speck in our eyes we've got to deal with. Hurts. But remember, if you're ignoring something bigger in that eye, your own eye, if you're ignoring the proverbial log, then be very, very careful. The slanderer, the gossip, generally ignores all the facts. They ignore the past. They don't see the person as they are the whole person. They only see one action, one time. They set aside love. They're not interested in restoring. They want to tear down. I remember hearing of a church where one of the leaders told a man, he told him, do not come back. Now, you never say that. It might well be in circumstances, look, there are some things you really need to deal with so we can have real fellowship. But you don't say that to a brother or sister. You don't use words that hold up no hope of restoration and fellowship. The slanderer puts aside God's law and he inserts his or her own laws instead. Jesus tells us to be afraid of the one who can cast both soul and body into hell. It's been said that just like Moses shattered God's laws on Mount Sinai, just he shattered them, we break God's law when we judge and speak evil of our fellow believers. So when we engage in evil speaking and slandering, it goes way beyond what we did to the person. Understand that. It goes way beyond what we might have done to that person. We are sinning against God, and we are worse. We are putting ourselves in the place of who God is, and He's the only one that gets to occupy that throne of judgment. We're infringing on God's prerogative. There's a lot more to slandering than we ever imagined. We need to pray with the psalm writer. Psalm 141:3, set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth, and keep watch over the door of my lips.